Understanding the Cold War, 1945 to 1991. That's a lot of Cold War. We're going to buzz through it hopefully pretty quickly. Here we go. So Truman was sworn in after FDR's death, and really to understand the Cold War, you got to go back into World War II, as we've talked about in class before. FDR had been elected to an unprecedented fourth term, but he was pretty sickly and ill, and he dies very early in that term. And so then Truman has the job and the task of ending the war, and then essentially figuring out what to do with Europe, which leads us into this Cold War with the Soviet Union. So one of the big questions was, did the United States need to drop the atomic bomb on Japan in order to end World War I? A great film to watch that gets you some ideas about the end of World War II, not World War I, World War II, and the decision to drop the bomb. And then it gets into Vietnam, is a film called The Fog of War. I highly recommend you watch that for extra credit. So Hiroshima was the first city on Japan's largest island of Honshu. It was a large regional supply station of military supplies. It was a key center for shipping. And the first bomb, Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima by a crew in a B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay. It is estimated that 80,000 people died in the dropping of directly as a result of that bomb being dropped. And by the end of the year, the injuries and radiation sickness brought the total casualties to anywhere from 90,000 to 140,000, depending on what studies and you're looking at. Approximately 69% of the city's buildings were completely destroyed, and it is the first city and only one of two to ever be subjected to a nuclear war. Nagasaki was the second city because the Japanese did not unconditionally surrender after the first bomb. The president waited and then dropped another bomb on August 9th, 1945, and it was also another large industrial city that was supplying the Japanese war machine, and it is estimated that 40,000 people died in that bomb drop. According to statistics given at the Nagasaki Peace Park, the dead totaled 73,000 and injured 74,000. This bomb was called Fat Man. So the decision to invade the island of Japan or drop the bomb, there were some estimates by military personnel that a land invasion would cost 500,000 lives in both civilian and army lives. And we had the fear and the issues of the kamikaze bombers, as well as the Iwo Jima battle, which the Japanese had fought very fearlessly and valiantly, but they would actually going for blood for sure in that battle. So the decision was to drop the bomb. So here you can see the devastation as a result of the dropping of the bomb in World War II. So now this gets us to, now we have this awesome, and awesome meaning awe-inspiring, sort of bomb that was terrifying. We had a fear of communism, Churchill's fear of that Iron Curtain falling down in Europe. So how do we rebuild Europe when the Russians have their sights on Europe as well? You have George Kennan, who was writing saying that our policy should be of containment. And in 1949, you have the Chinese, which become a communist nation, and the democratic government of Chiang Kai-shek collapses in a civil war. You have Korea in 1950. You have Cuba and Castro in 1962. You have McCarthy and McCarran, and someone never taught us kindergarten. Apparently, we didn't spell very well. But in communism, the major resources, and that's why they're all spelled with a C, are owned and run by the government. Factories, farms are owned by the community and not by individuals. And you all work for the good of the community. Until final victory, dictatorship of the proletariat is required under communism, meaning until everybody falls in line, then you have to have a dictatorship until the whole world is communist. Translation: a dictatorial one-party government must repress free speech and private property and profit to maintain communism. Winston Churchill, who was prime minister at the end of the war, in his Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Missouri, sort of first coined this idea of the Iron Curtain, which was an invisible line in Eastern Europe where nations were under the control of the United Soviet States of Russia, also known as the Soviet Union, after World War II. George Kennan, a diplomat who had served in Moscow, wrote the long telegram and often wrote under the pseudonym of Mr. X. He wrote a foreign affairs article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, trying to show the world and the United States why it was that Stalin had his sights so heavily set on Eastern Europe. And he said the main element of any United States policy towards the Soviet Union must be that of long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russians' expansive tendencies, knowing that Stalin would not just be satisfied with one nation, but that we had learned some lessons from the appeasement of Hitler during World War II and that we needed to contain Stalin. So in 1947, after the war, the Truman Doctrine is issued, which sort of follows this policy of containment. The U.S. will support any nation that the U.S. government believes is threatened by communism, and they would do that by financially supporting them to rebuild Europe, the idea that Europe needed to have strong economies, to have strong democracies. And so this also meant that we would arm and send aid to forces in Greece and Turkey who were actively fighting communist intervention. And Greece and Turkey are really strategically located in sort of a borderland between the Middle East and Asia and Europe. And so strategically it was beneficial to the Russians and it was beneficial to the United States. So there's Mr. Truman. The Marshall Plan. That's General George C. Marshall. And his plan was for the rebuilding of Europe and sending actual cash and money and relief and aid to continue to support those Western European countries as they rebuilt from the devastation of World War II. And this was thought that if people had food in their bellies and jobs to grow the economy, that they would be less likely to support a communist or dictatorial regime. What was happening here at home? We had another sort of Red Scare take off, much like the one in the 20s, but there were some differences. The House Un-American Activities Committee was set up in 1938 and then abolished in 1975. From 1947 to 1949, it held what a lot of people called witch hunts. It was actively seeking out and forcing people to come testify before Congress and to sort of swear their alliance and loyalty. A lot of people called these witch hunts to root out communism. Many of the people that were targeted were of Jewish origin, many Hollywood types, actors, producers, directors. And Arthur Miller wrote the play, The Crucible, during this time. He was, I believe, one of the people that was targeted. And The Crucible is actually about the Salem witch trials, like the history of it. But he is living in the context of this modern Red Scare when he writes it. And he's sort of trying to draw parallels between this modern Red Scare and what happened to the women that were accused and men of witchcraft in Salem in the 1600s. In 1948 to 1945, Richard Nixon actually served on the House Un-American Activities Committee and was involved in the Alger Hiss case. And Alger Hiss was accused of all sorts of things. It was really controversial. At this point, Berlin is also being divided. In the post-World War II era, there are 4 zones. And Berlin is in the heart of East Germany, which is East Germany at this point is under Soviet control. Then the Soviets decide to blockade Berlin and prevent supplies being brought into the western zones, and that is when we have the Berlin Airlift from 1948 to 1949. And we just supplied during an 11-month operation the entire western part of the city with cargo planes and goods needed to stave off that blockade, and ultimately the Soviets gave up, and what was decided was that a wall would be built between East and West Berlin. At this point, America creates the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which is a regional defense alliance, and it said that, it would prevent the USSR from threatening international peace and stability, and that we would do everything to support our allies to fight communism. And it gets back to this idea that an attack on one, kind of like prior to World War I, is an attack on all, and that the U.S. would come to the aid of those nations if the USSR tried to invade or attack any of those nations. So in sort of their own form of solidarity with their Eastern Bloc nations, Russia formed the Warsaw Pact. So here you can see the nations. The NATO are in blue, and the Warsaw Pact are in red. Meanwhile, in 1949, Mao Zedong wins in a civil war against the sort of democratically elected Chiang Kai-shek, and he is forced to flee to Taiwan. The U.S. wants to wrest that power from the Soviet Union. They really didn't want to get pulled into that, though. And so we increase our military spending because at that point China is huge, not only territorially but population-wise. And we were just fearful that, these two giant Soviet nations would then have this ripple effect around the world. And so the United States really starts to increase our military defense spending, and we really thought that the Russians and the Chinese would ally. But what we didn't know is they actually don't get along all of that well and really did not cooperate from 1956 to 1961 with each other. They really didn't like each other, and they had some of their own border disputes. In 1950 to 1953, we get dragged into the Korean Peninsula. North Korea invades South Korea, and North Korea is being invaded with support by Chinese troops and Chinese military supplies. The U.S. joins a United Nations effort to sort of police this dispute between North and South Korea. At first, we send advisors, and then we really actually send lots of troops. In 1950, China solidly joined on North Korea's side of this conflict that had been going on. And these are all former nations that had been sort of run by imperialist countries in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So they're sort of trying to throw off imperialism and really take their fate and future into their own hands. But our fear was that they would become communist. The war lasts a fairly short time, and in fact, the television show MASH, which depicts the Korean War, actually lasted far longer than the war itself. It ends in an armistice. However, the war is never officially ended. There has been an armistice in effect since 1953, and Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. North and South Korea. A demilitarized zone was created, which is about a mile wide, and troops are stationed on either side. There's some interesting environmental impacts with this demilitarized zone. It is really returning to its all-natural state, having been sort of left alone for 60 years. That armistice is still in effect today, and the North and South Korea is still divided. Families were split, and we know that today with Kim Jong-un in power, it is one of the nations that does have a nuclear weapon, and they are still a threat to their neighbors, and people don't have a lot of rights, and there is very little freedom in that country. But there's the show MASH. So after Korea, we continue with the National Security Council document of 68 that encouraged an arms buildup and a major increase in U.S. defense spending. Stalin's Korea actions urges the U.S. to turn NATO into a permanent military structure. So there is a military arm of NATO. There are actual NATO troops. And because of China and Stalin's issues and actions in Korea, we got kind of motivated to militarize our alliance system and help boost those European nations' military might as well. Here in the United States,